My lady, may I please call Mr. Boris Johnson?
Thank you. Yes, thank you. I swear by Almighty God
The evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall
shall
give
be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
and
and
nothing but the truth.
Thank you very much. Thank you, sir.
Thank you for coming back to help us, Mr. Johnson.
Absolute pleasure.
Can I ask you please to give the inquiry your full name?
Yes, I'm Boris Johnson.
Mr. Johnson, you ought to have before you a statement that bears the number INQ 000588008.
Yes, thank you.
Can you confirm that the contents of that statement are true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
Yes,
And I think, Mr. Johnson, it's right that this was your fifth witness statement for the inquiry.
Yes.
Is that correct?
I think so, yes.
I want to start, if I may, by asking you about events near to the start of the outset of the pandemic, please. It was the evidence of Sir John Coles to this inquiry that when he read the witness statement of Sir Gavin Williamson about the preparation for school closures prior to the 18th of March, that he almost fell off his chair. What was your reaction to reading Sir Gavin Williamson's statement about that?
Well, I've got every respect for Sir John Coles and his views. I read Gavin's statement with interest. Was there any particular aspect of his statement that you wanted to raise?
Perhaps let me develop this and explore it a bit further. What, in essence, Sir Gavin Williamson was saying, and I hope that this is a fair summary of his evidence, is that he didn't seek assessment of the impact of school closures, and nor did he seek to develop planning for mass school closures because, and these were the words he used in his oral evidence, the steer I was hearing from, whether it was in Cabinet or anything else, was to keep things open, not about closing things. And he went on to confirm what he had said in his statement. And let me read it to you. The position across the whole of government in February was largely monitoring the situation, and there was no suggestion that the Department for Education should prepare a plan or a policy for mass school closures. It was very much a case of the whole of government waiting for Number 10 and Cabinet Office to give a lead and clear direction.
Well, I'm not sure I agree with the idea that there was no planning for school closures, because if you look at the sequence from February onwards, it's clear that SAGE is talking about the possibility, the Cabinet is discussing it in March, certainly. I remember the subject coming up repeatedly. And then if you look at the paper of I think there's a citing note from the DFE on the 15th of March to me for a meeting in which they go over all kinds of stuff that are going to be necessary to enact school closures, looking at safeguarding, looking at exams, looking at the needs of vulnerable kids, teacher training, and so on, free school meals. All of that was in there. So that indicated to me at the time, and I'm fairly sure I remember it, but certainly indicates to me now that work was going on in the DFE about school closures, and it'd be amazing if it wasn't.
Yes, but Mr. Johnson, that note was on the 15th of March, so at a very late stage in the day, correct?
Yes.
And what we're focused on is the period leading up to that and what planning was going on prior to that point, correct?
Yes. I'm afraid I can't tell you very much about that, except to say that my evidence from what I saw is that the work had been going on, because there were clearly discussions that had been taking place.
Could we bring up on screen, please, the witness statement of the then Permanent Secretary to the Department for Education, Mr. Jonathan Slater, and that's INQ 000588040. That's page 12, paragraph 5.9. Because Mr. Johnson, he says in terms, and we can read it here, equally, it would have been much better if Department for Education had been invited to start developing contingency arrangements for closing education settings at an earlier stage in the pandemic, given that no contingency plan had been prepared beforehand. But as can be seen from the fact that the first request we received was on the 17th of March, the government was determined right up to the last minute to keep education settings open. Mr. Johnson, that's the Permanent Secretary to the Department for Education saying that there was no contingency plan prior to that point.
Well, I think that it's certainly where I certainly agree with him is that the government was determined, if we possibly could, to keep educational settings open, to keep schools open, because, as the inquiry has heard many, many times, one of the biggest detriments from COVID was the loss of education, the harm it did to young people. So that is certainly correct. I see that he's saying that no request was received from government to do a contingency plan, but frankly, I would have thought that he is, as Secretary of the head of the Department of Education, would have picked up from discussions that would be going on from February onwards that there was work to be done in this area. And indeed, it seems to me that work had been done in this area, because, and I cite the paper I saw.
Well, we're going to come to that paper, but I think we have it in black and white, don't we, from Mr. Slater, that there wasn't a contingency plan because he says one hadn't been requested. Now, you may dispute the lack of request.
I'm not necessarily disputing that. I just think that it was obvious that there had to be consideration of closing schools. I was very much hoping that we wouldn't have to close schools. I thought it was a nightmare idea. But I think it would, I think as far as I can remember, you had other countries were starting to close schools.
Yes.
And I'm surprised that the Perm Sec at the DFE didn't feel that it was necessary to look at what contingency arrangements we had.
Can I interrupt? Would you expect, running the United Kingdom as Prime Minister, would you expect the Department for Education to wait for a request for them to develop contingency plans?
No, of course not. And I think that, as I say, I think that my impression from the stuff I read was that a great deal of thought and care was already going into some of the key questions. But this is what Mr. Slater he says he had no plan ready. I think that is surprising.
I mean, we've also heard evidence from Miss Susan Ackland-Hood, who is now the Permanent Secretary to the Department for Education, who's also reviewed all of the paperwork, and who confirms that there wasn't planning beyond the possibility, for example, of some individual school closures, or for the possibility that there might be staff shortages. So it isn't simply that this is Mr. Slater saying this. Indeed, that would be surprising. It's been confirmed by the department on their overall consideration of the written material. But one assumes, Mr. Johnson, from your evidence that this is all in effect news to you, that there was this absence of planning behind the scenes, correct?
I think that there was certainly, as I understood the position at the time, to the best of my memory, there was work going on in the DFE about how to deal with the consequences of COVID, and in particular, how to compensate for the loss of learning. And, the paper that I've mentioned that only appeared before me on the 15th seemed to suggest to me that a great deal of work had been done on the key areas.
We'll come back to that paper, but I just want to be clear about this. Do you accept that until mid-March 2020 there hadn't been a cross-government focus on closing schools?
I think that it was a subject that had repeatedly cropped up at SAGE meetings, at SPIMO, all of which the relevant departments had been represented, and there had been, including DFE. So, no, I don't really accept that. I think that there had already been conversations about the possibility of closing schools, and it looked to me as though the DFE was preparing for that.
And I think that's right in terms of what you've said on your witness statement, and perhaps if we could bring that up, please, in terms of what you say at your paragraph 5. And I think it's suggested from this, Mr. Johnson, that what you're confirming here is that by the 10th of February 2020, it was already apparent or patent that school closures might be necessary as part of your response to the pandemic.
Yes, though, the documents that I've looked at recently, and the SPIMO and the SAGE papers, and I seem to remember this also from the time. And one of the difficulties is my memory is now contaminated by what I've recently read. What they seem to suggest is that early on, the advice on school closures from the scientists was it was not not necessarily a particularly effective tool of controlling the pandemic, certainly not on its own, and that clearly changed as we got closer to the decision, and the key weekend was March the 14th. When all that changed.
Turn to that, but do you accept, and the inquiry has been through the scientific advice that was provided from the 4th of February, that from the 4th of February onwards it was being advised by SAGE that school closures were at least in contemplation as a
absolutely.
possible?
Yes.
And do you accept that given all of that advice from February, and notwithstanding that it was not the decision anyone had wanted to make, that there had to be planning for the possible eventuality of school closures because the implications were enormous?
And what I'm trying to say to you is that I believe that there was such planning. What I don't think, and clearly from what Mrs. Ackland Hood and what Mr. Slater have said, they don't feel that there was a fully worked up plan for how to deal with everything. I can't tell you now why that was the case, but I can offer at the time, don't forget that we didn't know the effect this disease had on kids. We didn't know much about the transmissibility of the disease. There were all sorts of things that were simply unknown and difficult to plan for, and the thing was moving very fast. And from the point of view of Number 10, we were focused very much on trying to stave off, trying to avoid an appalling public health crisis. And we were focused on getting enough ventilators, on getting enough PPE, trying to avoid a significant number of casualties. And I think it's important for the inquiry to remember that at the time that the school closures were first mentioned, they were seen as something you'd put in at the peak of the pandemic. And we didn't think we were yet at the peak of the pandemic, if you saw what I mean.
And I just want to come back, just sticking for a moment on when you your understanding as to the position about school closures and when they were being posited. If we go to paragraph 20, please, on page 7 of your statement. And again, you say here the issue of school closures was on the government's agenda as soon as it became clear how dangerous COVID was. I think that DFE and Gavin were aware that we were considering mass school closures of schools from very early on. Thank you. That can come down.
I think that's right. School closures were clearly going to be part of the panoply of things that we might be able to do to defeat COVID. I wanted to keep it to the very, very last. It was something that I thought was a terrible thing to do, and it would have awful consequences for young people, particularly those who were least able to cope. So, although there was consideration of school closures, and the idea was being discussed, and as I say, I think I can see evidence that this was going on in the DFE at the time. As a worked up policy and plan, we thought it was premature. We didn't think it was. I didn't think it was something we were going to have to implement as fast as we did, if at all.
We'll come to the timing of it, but just staying with the potential the implications of school closures. You say at paragraph 21 of your statement that you knew when you made the decision to close schools on the 18th of March that the consequences would be devastating for all children, but worse for vulnerable children, correct?
Yes.
And I think if we can go to the document that you've mentioned, this document of the 15th of March.
Yes.
And that's INQ 000106221.
Yeah.
That set out, didn't it, in headline form, Mr. Johnson, what the implications of the closure of schools would be. So in other words, and potentially the most significant of all, that 9 million pupils wouldn't be guaranteed to receive an education, and that any education they did receive would typically be limited, yes?
Yes.
That 1.3 million of the poorest children wouldn't receive their free school meal. That remote learning would not work for all. That schools' ability to provide it was hugely variable, and many children didn't have access to the relevant kit, and many children didn't live in adequate home circumstances or environments, and didn't have Wi-Fi. And if we drop down perhaps to the last bullet, that vulnerable children are much safer in school than out, and here pointing to the 400,000 children who had a social worker who might be at risk, and it says here from inadequate parenting, witnessing domestic violence, particularly if families are also facing the pressure of imposed isolation.
Yeah.
And presumably, Mr. Johnson, you appreciated too that below that threshold of children who had a social worker, there were many other children who would be at risk as well.
Absolutely.
Thank you, that can come down. And do you accept that the consequences for children were so grave and so far-reaching of school closures that they were the responsibility of all of government, that it wasn't just a Department for Education responsibility?
Of course. And I should say that I take, because I was saying, but as I told this inquiry before, I take full responsibility for all the ones that we took, and all mistakes that were made were mistakes that I am accountable for and take responsibility for. And insofar as we got things wrong, then of course I apologise for that, and as I've done before to this inquiry. I remain very proud, of course, of a lot of things that I think the teachers, the schools did to cope with this unbelievably difficult set of circumstances, and I think that on the whole they acquitted themselves outstandingly well.
Just focusing on that, on the events of the 15th, 16th and 17th of March. Can you explain why, given this whole government responsibility for the implications of school closures, why it was only on the 16th, 17th of March that first of all a paper was commissioned in order to set out the proposals or the options for keeping schools open?
I think that you've got to go back to the problem that we had of timing, and I think in my evidence to this inquiry earlier on, I pointed out that there'd been a great acceleration in the understanding of the scientists about where we were on the pandemic curve. And if you remember, so to the weekend of March 14th, 15th, it becomes obvious that things have moved much faster, and school closures, which March, February 10th and so on, the stage are saying are not necessarily something we'll want to bring in. I think even on March the 5th, Chris Whitty is saying it's not something we want to do imminently. It becomes clear that the spike is going up so fast that, sadly, school closures are going to have to be part of the initial package, and that's effectively what we had to do. I mean, there were other factors as well. The people were, as you know, the teachers were self-isolating, and some schools were finding it difficult to operate anyway.
I think what might be very difficult to understand is why, given the gravity of the consequences of closing schools, that nonetheless seeking out papers on keeping schools open came at such last minute and just before you ended up having to make the decision to close schools.
Well, as I think I've tried to explain why I think that was the case. We were focused on trying to delay the peak of the pandemic, and we thought that the closure of schools, if it had to be used at all, would be a measure of last resort. And lastly, it was my impression that the work was being done, and I certainly assumed that the work was being done.
I'm just focusing here on why at the centre these questions are only being asked so late in the day. So in other words, the centre is only asking for proposals to keep schools open at this very, very late stage, only to reverse the position within about 24 hours and to ask for options on closing schools.
Well, I think that's entirely understandable, given the immensity of the decision and the detriments that it was likely to have.
Does the fact that these questions were being asked so late in the day demonstrate that the problem and the failures of planning were systematic failures and not just failures on the part of the Department for Education?
No, I don't. Well, as I say, I'm not certain that the Department for Education was quite as remiss as you've said, and I think my impression was that they'd done a lot of work. And when you look at what was achieved during the period when schools were closed, I think people responded pretty heroically to the challenge. You say so late in the day, but so late in the day is, of course, a phrase that is only open, or a judgment's only open to people who are operating with hindsight. We didn't know how COVID was being transmitted. We didn't know to what extent children and young people were affected by it. It was very difficult. We didn't know the state of the pandemic in the country. It was very difficult to plan for how schools exactly should respond. And it remained very difficult throughout the throughout the pandemic.
But you've accepted that the possibility of school closures was being posited as a specific step that could be taken in response to the pandemic from the very earliest stages of the SAGE advice. And you've accepted that the implications of closing schools were enormous for almost every school-age child in this country, correct?
Yes.
And you must accept that that therefore put a responsibility on government to grasp the nettle and really think about what it needed to do if schools were in fact going to close to most children.
And
yes?
as I've said to you, it looks to me as though that's exactly what the DfE was doing. And as it happens, the schools sadly did close.
Yeah.
And we did our level best to remediate the damage and to give kids the education that they needed as far as we could.
What work was it that you thought was being done in the background to prepare schools for the eventuality of having to close? What was it you saw that gave you the confidence that this planning was going on in the background?
The document that I've cited, because and maybe it was misleading, but it seemed to me to suggest that a good deal of work was being done on vulnerable kids, on exams, all the subjects that I've mentioned.
Perhaps we should look at that document then, Mr. Johnson, just to see what it says, if that's what your evidence is focused on. Can we go back, please, to INQ 000106221? I think if we go, please, to page 3. It sets out, doesn't it, a summary of some of the DfE's current contingency planning. So it set out, I think, at the start that there is some scenarios for free school meals, correct?
Yes.
On remote learning, if we drop down, please. We intend this week to publish guidance on the steps that schools should now be taking. Correct?
Yes.
So you must have appreciated that prior to this point, there hadn't even been guidance sent to schools in order to assist.
I do, but I think also the inquiry would appreciate that we hadn't had a pandemic like this for a very long time.
Yes.
The eventuality of closing schools was one that we regarded with horror, and one that we didn't think we would have to resort to until the peak of the pandemic.
Well, I think, Mr. Johnson, that's understood that closing schools would be a terrible decision, but it was because the consequences were so profound that it needed to be properly planned for, yes?
I think, of course, and if you look at the document that we're studying, it's clear that they're going through various scenarios to deal with most of the problems that you can think of. They've got 3 scenarios being developed for exams within Ofqual. They're publishing guidance on remote learning. It seems to me that yes, I mean, I would accept that the reality was slow to dawn on government generally about the full horror of COVID, but that's something that we've been around many times. I think and you can see it in the way the scientific advice changes throughout the year. So they move from saying, put these measures on during the peak of the pandemic to saying go hard, go early. And there's a clear difference in approach.
Mr. Johnson, I'm just going to stay on this document for a moment to look at the last of the implications, which is that of vulnerable children.
Can you remind me of the date, Mr.
Yes, it's the 15th of March.
Thank you.
And as we can see there, in respect of vulnerable children and childcare, this paper doesn't deal with it, Mr. Johnson. So there's nothing here, for example, that sets out Department for Education thinking about child protection systems, all of the other support and services that schools provide to children, and particularly those most in need.
I think it's meant to be a short citing document. It's not meant to be going through everything that is in the head of the department. Look, I understand the criticism that we should have planned better for school closures and we should have alerted schools earlier to the possibility of school closures and spelt out in more detail what might happen in the context of school closures. All I can say to you is that is to imagine a much greater state of knowledge about COVID and what was likely to happen than we actually had at the time, and in particular a greater state of knowledge about the speed with which the disease was progressing. And I go back to yes, I think it's a fair point that this document itself doesn't look like a fully worked up plan for school closures, but it seems to me that the department was doing the work.
All right. Well, Mr. Johnson, we were looking at that document so that the inquiry could understand what it was that gave you confidence about Department for Education planning. But I think you're clear that this is the sole basis for that confidence, correct?
Well, there were plenty of other meetings and discussions in which DFE officials were involved when it was obvious, as you've said, that school closures were coming down the agenda. And it was always obvious to me that this was going to be one of the things we would have to consider.
I'm going to move on, if I may, to ask about the 16th and 17th of March, and specifically the evidence that was given by Sir Gavin Williamson in his witness statement, which you've seen and which he confirmed in oral evidence, that there was this discombobulating sea change, to which I've already alluded to, between the 16th and 17th of March, whereby the government's direction went from keeping schools open to overnight to keeping schools closed. Do you agree with his evidence that it was a discombobulating sea change?
Well, obviously I can't speak for Gavin about how he felt about it, but my impression was that everybody understood that school closures was part of the toolkit that we might sadly have to use, and we were being forced by events and by the spread of the disease to deploy that solution much earlier than we wanted, and indeed against our will, just by the spread of the disease. So I'm afraid the reality of COVID just meant that we had to get the R down below 1, and school closures represent, though not a very significant measure in themselves, they can help to get the R down below 1 at critical moments, and we had no choice.
Yes, so I think, Mr. Johnson, is your evidence that it wasn't a sea change, it was simply a speeding up of that which was going to happen in any event?
I mean, I'm not saying that it was necessarily going to happen in any event, but because things might have turned out differently, but they didn't. What it certainly was the result of a gradual and then accelerating progression in the disease, which is familiar to anybody who looks at one of those curves.
Thank you. Sir John Cole said of Sir Gavin Williamson's evidence about school closures that he thought that it was an extraordinary dereliction of duty. So he was referring again to the lack of planning for school closures. And he said it was perfectly clear to me, as someone who was running schools, that there was a high likelihood that schools would have to close. And we were planning for that, whilst of course doing everything we could to keep schools open. If it is right to characterise the lack of planning as a dereliction of duty, do you accept that that's a dereliction that's shared by the whole of government and not just the Department for Education?
Well, as I've tried to argue this morning, I think that the department, contrary perhaps to, it felt to me as though there had been abundant discussions about closing schools, and it felt to me, to the best of my recollection, as though the department was aware of this, and I assumed that they were planning for it. When I look at that document of March the 15th, it seems to me to suggest that a great deal of work and thought had gone into the key issues. So I'm not inclined to accept the idea that people fell down gravely in their duty. I think people were overwhelmed by the speed of events, and when the facts changed, they had to change policy, and I had to change policy.
So you don't accept that the evidence from the then Permanent Secretary that there was no contingency plan for school closures, or there wasn't planning that focused on the potential for mass school closures, you don't think that that's a dereliction of duty? Is that what you're saying?
Well, I can only repeat what I've just said. I understand. I know that Mr. Slater later resigned. Though not over that matter, as far as I can remember, I don't think. If you're the Perm Sec at the DFE, there's nothing to. There was certainly no. Let me put it this way: there was absolutely nothing coming from the central government to say you must not, on any account, prepare for school closures. On the contrary, anybody looking at what was happening would have assumed that school closures was something that had to be encompassed and prepared for. And from what I can see of the department's thinking, they were indeed doing that.